sunset to hold my wonder. Give me an ocean to hold my tears. For I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It is others, those who go before us, so lift me up to the light of change.
All week I've been reminding people of a joke. Do you know how we know that Jesus had dark skin? Because he was killed by the authorities. It's become a ubiquitous story. A young man in the 4th decade of his life. The people who knew him liked him. But the authorities who did not know him thought he was a bad dude. They were afraid of him, and although he had no weapons, they killed him. Right out in the open air, they pierced his side and ultimately took his life. It is a story that's being talked about all over the country, all over the world today. Now, am I talking about Jesus or am I talking about Terrence Crutcher? The answer is yes. It sounds like the same story, doesn't it? Both men killed in the open air because they were seen as a threat by those in authority, even though they didn't really know him. In the case of Terrence Crutcher, the police officer who was seeing him from a helicopter said, "He looks like a bad dude." From hundreds of feet in the air, looking down, what could that officer really see? In the video that the police office quite wisely and quickly released this week, we hear the police officer in the helicopter saying exactly, "He looks like a bad dude," which can be heard by all the other officers who are down on the ground. Now, what can he see besides an unknown man walking slowly with his hands in the air that makes the officer of the law characterize him as a bad dude from so far away? He can see that he's big. He can see that he's black. But bad? I heard about an 8th grader here in Tulsa this week. And he's also big. And he's black. This young man weighs 198 pounds, and his father works in the criminal justice system. Even though he's only 13 years old, his dad decided this week that it was time to have the talk that all African American parents have to have with their children, particularly their boys. He said, "Son, do you know what to do if the police ever stop you?" And the boy said, "Well, put my hands up in the air and listen politely to whatever they say." And his dad said, "No, son. I want you to lay down with your arms out and your hands open, spread eagle, face down on the ground, and do not move." The boy said, "Really, Dad?" And his father said, "Yes, that's the one position in which you cannot in any way be perceived as a threat." Now, this is a father just trying to keep his son, who is a good dude and a great student and an athlete, alive. At this point, for this dad, it's not a matter of dignity, it's not a matter of rights or anything other than he wanted to keep his beloved son from becoming the next casualty in this epidemic that is spreading across our nation of black males, but also females, being killed by police, even when they're unarmed. He wants his son to come home alive, just like all of us do. That's the America that this son and this father are both living in. And his father is not someone for whom the police and policing is some distant, scary thing. He works in the criminal justice system, and he works with police officers every day. This is the state of affairs for black and brown men and boys in America in the beginning of the 21st century. Now, if you're white, and like 76% of Americans, you don't socialize with anyone who's African American. So you might not really know that the fear about the fear and the anger and the trauma that the African American community in this country is feeling right now. It's not a condemnation, it's not a judgment, it's most Americans who are white have no social contact with any African American. So how could they know other than what we see on the media? So this Monday night, after Police Chief Chuck Jordan released the videos of the killing of Terrence Crutcher, a group of our church's intercultural leaders got together. And we formed a circle and we listened and we shared with one another how we were feeling. And that's when one African American young man said that he was glad to be in this circle because all day he'd been at work and he's surrounded by other white co-workers, and he could not tell whether they were really upset. He certainly said they didn't look like they were anywhere near as enraged as he was. That's when he asked me, do white people really get angry? And I assured him that white people know how to get angry. And I reminded him that when we put Black Lives Matter on the sign in front of the church, some white people got really angry. They weren't members of the church. It was outside in the community. And when Colin Kaepernick decided to stand up for racism by sitting down during the national anthem, a lot of white people got really angry. So it's not an issue of whether white people get angry. The issue is that we're not always getting angry about the right things. Now, if we're going to be honest, we have to humbly acknowledge that this country is a country that from its founding has mischaracterized people with darker skin. Whether their skin was black or brown or red or even yellow, judged by their color, people were seen as dangerous, untrustworthy, uncivilized, or even soulless. And so this country of the free and the brave was founded on a fundamental compromise, which was that while we affirm that all men are created equal and with inalienable rights, black men and women and children were not considered fully human. Eventually, we fought the Civil War, the most deadly war in this nation's history, to try to come to terms with this essential contradiction that lays at the heart of our nation's self-understanding and culture at the time. President Lincoln famously characterized the Civil War as a kind of providential penitence or atonement that was the painful payment, if you will, for the bargain that was struck with this nation's original compromise. Or in religious language, we could call it America's original sin. And the country paid for it with the blood sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of its young men. And that war, emancipation, and reconstruction were the first wave of a nation beginning to reckon with a fundamental flaw at the heart of its conception. The reaction to the end of slavery and the freeing of the slaves was mixed, but it certainly was not an immediate resolution of equality and justice for all. Jim and Jane Crow laws quickly were passed, and all kinds of political and social structures were created that reinforced that black and brown people, and in this part of the country, red people as well, were not equal. Now, these prejudices were literally written into many laws. The first laws passed here in Oklahoma when the legislature of Oklahoma just founded as a state, the very first laws they passed were Jim Crow laws. The first laws that founded this state. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the low point of race relations in this country. And we saw lynchings and race riots happening across the nation. Now, race riot back then meant something different than it means today. A race riot back then meant white people uprising, going into a black community and destroying the homes and businesses and killing members of the community. That's what a race riot was. Now, while white people would make postcards and send postcards of the race riots, like the one here in 1921, and of lynchings. You can find them. There's historical documents. We see them in museums. You can find them online. Postcards sent around the country of pictures of these events. Here in 1921, 35 blocks of this city were destroyed, burned to the ground. Businesses, homes, hundreds of people dead. It was like ground zero in New York, but right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, destroyed, smoldering. Now, lynchings across the South were public events. They were events where people, doctors, lawyers, business people, all different kinds of people, they dress up and dress their children up in their Sunday best to go out and watch. Vendors would sell lemonade and ice cream. These children were raised to think that this was normal. They didn't know any different. It took the mass protests of the 1950s and 60s for a lot of these blatant, legalized forms of racism to end. Now, after the community vigil on Wednesday night for Terrence Crutcher, I spoke with an African-American woman whose mother was a race riot survivor. She was a small child during the race riot. She just died a few years ago, one of our last living survivors of the riot here in Tulsa. And she, the woman who I was talking to, she told me a story of when she was in middle school here in Tulsa. It was 1971, and Tulsa Public Schools finally began to try to comply with federal law to integrate the schools. She remembered the first day of school. She and the kids in her neighborhood were loaded up into a yellow school bus, and they were driven across town to Cleveland Elementary School. She said the kids were kind of rowdy on the bus, as kids are meant to do. It was the first day. It was full of, anxiety, and this was a whole new experience for everybody. So they were making a lot of noise and goofing around, probably just trying to deal with how they were feeling. She said when they came near the school, the bus driver stopped the bus. And all of a sudden, the kids all got really quiet. And out the window, in front of the school, were protesters, white protesters with signs and placards yelling and throwing rocks through the window of the school. And she said the bus driver, who was a white man, said to the kids, I was hired to keep you safe. It's my job to keep you safe. I can't drop you off at the school, and I can't take you home. So in a minute when I'm finished talking, I'm going to ask a couple of you boys in the back to open the back door, and I want all of you kids to run for your lives. And that's what they did. She said it was the scariest moment in her entire life. At 11 years old. This was 1971 America, Tulsa. That's only about 40 years ago. So when people talk about making America great again, what era exactly are they hearkening back to? What we can see is that the laws changed with the civil rights movement. Laws alone, though, don't change attitudes, and they don't change social structures and economic conditions that have existed for centuries. Now, don't get me wrong, things have changed. There has been progress, but there's still a long way to go. After centuries of cultural and institutional and economic and social racism, a culture and a society does not just change a law or do any one thing, and all of a sudden everyone's actions and attitudes just change. My point is that racial bias is baked into the foundations of this culture from the very beginning. It's ingrained in our collective psyche. Not just white people, all people in this country grow up in this culture and are affected. What's happening around our country right now is what Reverend William Barber III calls the third reconstruction. The first was after the Civil War, the second was the Civil Rights Movement, and the third is right now. It's happening right now. For the past few years, there have been marches and demonstrations in the streets and in the Capitol, in Washington, D.C., and all over this country. Police in riot gear and military vehicles have been deployed on the streets of our nation against our own citizens who are gathering mostly in peaceful protest. But it's not always peaceful, as we've seen this week in Charlotte, North Carolina. We've seen in Baltimore and other places. I'm really proud of how our city is responding right now. I give the bulk of the credit to our black leaders, our black church leaders particularly. The mayor's done a good job. The chief of police has done a good job. The district attorney has done a good job so far to keep things calm. But the black clergy in this community, as I understand, they did the same thing in 1960s and early 70s when the event I just described on the bus happened. Our black leaders said, we're going to do this peacefully, and we're going to make sure that there's change. And that's what's happening again. And it's incredible, the leadership that we have among our black leaders in this city. And I'm very proud to be among them as a colleague. But I only learned recently from some of you that during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, that most of this country didn't even realize that they were in the middle of a civil rights movement that was happening all around to change the culture. Because the thing is, people from my generation, including me, and many of us who weren't alive then or were too young then, we didn't realize that when Martin Luther King and others were marching and protesting, that we just assumed everyone in America was aware and everybody had chosen sides and it was happening and it was a big deal. That everyone knew they were in the midst of a major social revolution that was going to change America. And yet I've just learned from some of you that no, people didn't even know it was happening. Black people, white people. It was happening. They'd hear about, oh, there's a march and there was some stuff going on and some rabble-rousers. But it wasn't until close to the end when Selma happened and the white Unitarian minister, James Reeb, was killed and other events started happening in the March on Washington that people started to wake up. Oh my gosh, look what's happening in our country. Well, something was happening that was going to change everybody's lives, and it's happening again right now. What could be described as the second wave of the civil rights movement has been going on for the past few years, and some people are just now beginning to wake up and realize what's happening. There is a building mass movement for human rights in our nation that is happening right now. The death of Terrence Crutcher has brought this movement literally right to our doorstep. What I'm trying to make clear is that while yes, we have a serious and deadly problem with policing in our country right now, and it needs to be fixed, that problem is merely a manifestation of a much bigger problem, which is the racial bias and racism that affects all of us and our entire society. In other words, the police are not any different from you and me. And we should not make them out as the scapegoats in this moment. It makes complete sense when you think about the history of this country that we still have a lot of work to do to unlearn these ideas of race and race consciousness and all the ways in which we have been sort of indoctrinated from a young age into these ideas. We have a program here at All Souls that we've been running for a few years now called Rewire. It's really what we have to do. We practically have to rewire our brains in a way to begin to alter the patterns of prejudice that are conscious but mostly subconscious. And the police aren't different from us. The difference is that they carry guns and have a license to kill. That means that on the streets, they can become the judge, the jury, and the executioner in a split second. So the police need to be doing this kind of rewire program even more than the rest of us. They need to be ahead of the game. They need to be leading the rest of us because they know how dangerous it is. But we all, especially white people, have to see the importance of making intentional efforts to learn our nation's history and remember it, and also to do the work of understanding race and how it affects us and how it affects others so that we can begin to undo some of these patterns. And there are a lot of people and a lot of white people who've been talking to me and saying, I want to do it. How can we do it? So we are, people are asking me, they're saying, what can I do to be part of the solution? I see that we have a problem. It's undeniable at this point. What can I do? So next week, a week from this Thursday on October 6th, we're going to be hosting a forum here in this church called What's a White Person to Do? And we're going to have some African American leaders, and we're going to have some white leaders who are going to talk about what does it mean to show up in this moment? What does it mean to be part of the solution? And we're going to have that conversation and begin to start doing that work. It's a chance for people to talk and learn. But my point is that neither we nor the police are bad dudes. That's not what this is about. The point is that racism is a psychological disease that affects even good dudes and dudettes. And people like me. I'm still working it out. I'm still working through it myself, plenty. I've been doing it for years, but I'm still finding myself and catching myself having thoughts and ideas and acting in ways that, and recognizing where in different systems that I'm involved in, whether it's the school system with my kids or other systems that I'm involved in the church or otherwise, that baked into them are assumptions that continue to reinforce these patterns and structures of oppression. So they say that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it's getting. Our current system of policing is getting really bad results. And so it's time to change it. And our whole system needs some rewiring because we must improve the results that we're getting. I don't think any of us are real happy with the state of race relations in this country right now. If we are, we're really living in a cave somewhere. So far in the aftermath of the killing of Terrence Crutcher, Tulsa has shown to be a good model for addressing this kind of thing. I mean, it's too late. It's after someone's died, but at least we're responding as best that we can. And we have an opportunity to change what Tulsa is nationally known for. We're known nationally for the place where the worst race riot in American history has happened. And now, why don't we change that and become known as the city that started to change the system?
Yeah.
The story of the Bible says that we can free ourselves from bondage. The story of the Bible says that out of death can come new life. It's the story of the Exodus, it's the story of the resurrection, and it can be the story of Tulsa, and it can be the story of America. Let's wring some good out of this tragedy. Let's escape the bondage of racism and that keeps us trapped in systems that divide us and traumatize us. Let's pull new life out of the death of Terrence Crutcher. Terrence Crutcher died on the cross 6 miles from here. Many of us could say, Jesus died on the cross 6 miles from here on Friday a week ago. Because one way to understand the crucifixion is to understand that it is a symbol that is present anytime those who are marginalized are killed by those in power. And to understand the resurrection as a symbol that what we are called to do with such a death is to use it to overturn an unjust status quo. That's what sacrifice means. Sacrifice means to make sacred. To make something sacred, you sacrifice it. We can make the death of Terrence Crutcher sacred by ringing a new era of peace and justice for all. That's the good news that comes out of this bad situation. That's the whole point of the Gospels. The fact is, it's the whole point of our lives. We're here in this life to do more than to drink coffee and make posts on Facebook. We are here to do our part in the long history of moving humanity closer to justice and peace for all. We are here with a purpose. Don't sit out the revolution. Not this time. We need you. We all have a role to play. Let's make sure that we don't go back to business as usual. The killing of Terrence Crutcher and so many black and brown bodies by police has uncovered an uncomfortable truth about our nation. It reminds us that no matter how far we've come, we still have a long way to go. But we can get to the promised land together. Let's keep on moving forward. Amen. Do it.
We are your church, and we are proud to be your church, or at least a church that's having a positive impact on your life. I am personally blessed to be your minister, or at least a minister who you're allowing to speak into your life. I hope you'll support our ministry and share your love beyond belief by texting LOVEBB to 41444 or go to our website. But you can just text LOVEBB to 41444 and make your gift. It's wonderful. Thank you. Be blessed and be a blessing.